Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we really try and get into those moments, those huge history-changing decisions. And today, we're looking at something really intense. It's about Germany in World War I, specifically that run-up to 1918, their last desperate throw of the dice.
That's right. We're talking about a nation really pushed to the absolute edge, facing this impossible choice, negotiate a defeat that feels humiliating or gamble absolutely everything on one last massive offensive. And our sources, they give us this incredibly raw, painful look at that reality, the military thinking, the sheer horror of the trenches, and this slow collapse of the German home front because of starvation.
Yeah, it's a real paradox we're dissecting here, isn't it? How does the world's most efficient army, tactically, an army that had held the line against, well, half the globe for 4 years, how do they reach this point of just utter exhaustion, physically, psychologically, where the only option left felt like this complete catastrophic risk?
It really boils down to the psychology of loss, I think. We're exploring what it means when you're forced to commit to a gamble because the alternative, well, the alternative is admitting that all the suffering, everything you've endured, was for nothing.
I was really struck by that anecdote in one of the sources, the one about the U.S. official in East Africa. He runs into this former South African special forces guy who's just incredibly hostile towards Americans. And after it gets physical, the bartender explains it, doesn't he? He says, you Americans don't know what it's like to lose a war. Bob's mates died for a country that don't even exist no more.
Oof, yeah, that line. It's a gut punch. Because it takes the trauma beyond just losing territory or a political system. It's existential, isn't it? It's the trauma of realizing your ultimate sacrifice, the thing you gave everything for, has been completely erased. That's the psychological state we're talking about. It's the edge of no return.
And you see that idea captured so powerfully by William Faulkner, writing about Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. He talks about that split second, that razor-edge moment where the Confederate soldier still believes victory is possible, right before they plunge over the world's roaring rim. It's that point where you commit utterly, because the thought of settling for failure, the void that represents, it was just unbearable.
And history is full of examples, isn't it?
Yeah.
Great powers choosing the catastrophic gamble over a managed but unfavorable peace. You mentioned the Gauls against Caesar, that last doomed stand, or Jerusalem against Rome, basically inviting total destruction. And you can even see echoes, maybe, in more recent times. Think about Ukraine in early 2022 facing annihilation. The pressure to push for total victory versus settling for a negotiated peace, even a favorable one, must have been immense.
Right. And Germany in 1918 is standing right there on that terrifying edge. But what's so fascinating is that, strategically speaking, they almost had reason to feel the gamble was justified, didn't they? If you look at the situation in late 1917, the Allies, the Entente, they were actually in deep trouble.
Oh, absolutely. Germany was, strategically, in a surprisingly strong position then. The Allies had faced disaster after disaster. Start with France. Their army was the cornerstone of the Western Front, right? But after a failed offensive in spring 1917, which cost them dearly, mass mutinies just ripped through the ranks, thousands of soldiers refusing orders. The French high command was terrified. The whole army would collapse. They actually had to execute hundreds of their own men just to restore some kind of order.
Wow. So that means France, for the foreseeable future, they couldn't launch any major attacks. They were purely defensive, exhausted, and frankly broken internally. That must have given the Germans breathing room.
Huge breathing room. And then look east. The entire Eastern Front basically dissolves. The Tsar falls in Russia in March 1917, total chaos. The provisional government tries one last big offensive in the summer, and it's an absolute catastrophe. Something like 900,000 Russians against maybe 260,000 Central Powers troops. But it just leads to mass desertion, total demoralization.
And that paves the way for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, right? They seize power by early 1918 and pull Russia out of the war entirely. So suddenly, Germany has, 500,000 experienced troops freed up from the east?
Exactly. 500,000 men ready to be transferred to the west. And this huge troop movement happens just as the Allies suffer another massive defeat, this time down south, in Italy. October 1917, the Italian front collapses at the 12th Battle of the Isonzo River. Caporetto, yeah. Brutal mountain warfare there. And the Austro-Hungarians, but crucially, backed by 6 crack German divisions. And didn't one source mention that Erwin Rommel was there, a young officer then?
That's right, Rommel was there. And they absolutely crushed the Italian Second Army.
The scale of that defeat was enormous, wasn't it? Like 300,000 Italian casualties, killed, wounded, captured.
Devastating. The sources say Italy looked finished. Their prime minister was apparently making contingency plans to retreat and fight on from Sicily if the mainland fell.
So France is crippled, Russia is out, Italy is on the ropes. What about Britain? Britain was hurting too. The Battle of Passchendaele, or Pandendale as some called it, in Flanders. It was strategically pointless, just horrific losses in the mud. It basically hammered home to the average British soldier that attacking in the trenches was futile, so they were licking their wounds, relying heavily on their allies. Okay, so you put all that together. Ludendorff, the German military leader, he looks at the map, he sees the troops coming from the east.
And he sees this fleeting moment of opportunity. He calculates that for a very short time, the forces on the Western Front will be roughly equal. But, and this is the key, it's only for a brief window.
Why the urgency? What was the clock ticking down?
The Americans. Ludendorff said it himself, basically. We have to strike early, ideally late February, early March, before the Americans can really throw their weight into the fight. The U.S. was in the war, sure, but their army was still mobilizing, arriving relatively slowly. Ludendorff knew he had to win before America's industrial might and manpower fully kicked in. It was a race against time, a mathematical problem, really, but also driven by this deep psychological need for a final answer. And the German army itself, despite whatever was happening back home, they still believed in themselves, didn't they? 4 years holding off multiple empires. They thought they were the best army in the world. They were deep inside enemy lines, and now they could focus everything west.
Exactly. Morale among the troops being gathered for the offensive was actually quite high. There was this confidence, this supreme belief that they could deliver the final blow. Victory or utter collapse. There wasn't much room in between.
It's almost hard to reconcile that strategic confidence in late 1917 with the sheer awfulness of what life had been like on the front lines for 3 years. Germany might have felt they had a tactical edge, but the cost, the human cost, was just unbelievable.
The math alone is brutal.
Oh, the mathematics of it are just staggering. We throw around casualty numbers, but think about 1916. Someone calculated it at 23 men killed, wounded, or missing every single minute. That's 1,400 an hour. Over 30,000 a day. Just mind-boggling. For 1916 alone, that's over 12 million casualties across all sides. And by early 1918, you're looking at maybe 26 to 28 million men taken out of the war in total. And that's where the resource difference really bites the Central Powers, isn't it? Germany could inflict huge losses, sure, but the Allies could replace theirs more easily. They had these vast colonial empires drawing on maybe 700 million people globally, compared to what, 140 million for the Central Powers?
Exactly. Germany was just fundamentally outnumbered and running out of men, running out of material they couldn't replace.
And this reality, it feeds into the psychological horror of it all. It brings us to why the trenches were so uniquely terrifying.
Huh?
I remember that quote from the Navy SEAL commander Jocko Willink, asked which war he'd least want to fight in. Always World War I.
Yeah, that's telling, coming from him. And the reason fundamentally is the loss of agency. Think about it. In most combat, you believe your actions matter, right? Sprinting, ducking, taking cover, shooting back. It gives you some sense, maybe an illusion, but some sense of control over your fate.
Right, you feel like you can do something.
Exactly. But in the trenches of the Great War, fate felt completely arbitrary. The danger wasn't usually another soldier you could see and fight. It was this invisible, mechanical death raining down from miles away. Artillery, gas. Ernst Jünger, the German writer who fought through it, he wrote about the soldier being stamped with the mark of the animal. The environment itself felt hostile, like primeval times. War became a profession. Warriors became day laborers of death. There was no space left for heroism or romance. The conditions just crushed it out of you.
And even before the enemy started shooting, the environment itself was trying to kill you, especially in Flanders, in Belgium, and northern France, that low-lying land often below sea level.
Right. You dig a trench, you immediately hit water. Bailing water wasn't just a chore. It was like the main job for months on end, 9-10 months a year. Guys were just constantly shoveling out mud and water with buckets, spades, anything, knowing that the second they stopped, maybe because shells are coming in or they just collapsed from exhaustion, the water would rise right back up, sometimes waist high, armpit high.
And the filth. Unimaginable. Trenches doubled as latrines, so you're standing for days, potentially, in freezing water mixed with human waste, blood. Just awful. And then the sheer weight of the gear.
Yeah, the greatcoats, the equipment, none of it was waterproof. It just soaked up the mud and water, added maybe 25, 35 pounds to the already heavy standard kit. There are accounts of British soldiers carrying maybe 90, 100, even 110 pounds total. Now, picture that on the average soldier back then. The average British Tommy was about 112 pounds. Americans were considered big at 141 pounds on average. These loads were designed for much bigger men. The physical strain was immense.
Which led directly to things like trench foot. Standing in that cold wetness just kills the circulation. The flesh dies, turns black, often meant amputation. And the sources say the only way to prevent it was drying your feet, coating them in whale oil. Luxuries most frontline soldiers rarely had time or opportunity for.
And the smell. Oh, God, the smell. Men reported smelling the front lines, places like Verdun or the Somme, miles before they got there. It was this pervasive stench of sweat, unwashed bodies, latrines, chemicals, gas, and overwhelming everything, the smell of rotting corpses.
Because you couldn't always bury the dead, could you? Sources talk about soldiers stacking bodies to sit on to get out of the water or using a pile of corpses as a card table. A necessary numbness set in.
A terrible numbness. The rats. The rats didn't get numb.
The rats. Always the rats.
Huge, bold, absolutely fearless,
Yeah.
gorging themselves on the dead. One source even noted they became picky eaters because there was so much human flesh around. Often they just eat the eyes and the liver.
There's that horrifying story, isn't there? The soldier wounded and paralyzed in no man's land after a mine explosion. His comrades could hear him screaming for help, but couldn't get to him because of the shooting. And then at night, the screams changed from pain to just raw terror as the rats found him. His friends had to lie there and listen to him being eaten alive until he finally passed out. That kind of environmental arbitrary horror, it's soul-destroying.
And all of that was just the baseline misery before the enemy even got involved. When the shelling started or the attacks came, the scale of the slaughter is hard to grasp. Think about the Somme again. 60,000 British casualties on the first day.
The first day, and the battle went on for months, over 1 million casualties in total.
And the constant artillery fire. It wasn't just physically dangerous, it caused widespread psychological damage. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD or TBI. The noise alone was overwhelming. During big barrages, individual explosions blurred into just one endless roar. Shells didn't just whistle, they screamed overhead like locomotives.
That constant noise, the constant vibration, the near misses, it literally caused brain injuries, didn't it? And the feeling of being hunted. That quote from Guy Chapman, the British officer.
Yeah, feeling hunted like an animal in a cage. Naked beneath that sky of iron, a sky filled with hatred. That sense of relentless mechanical extermination.
Ymer said something similar, didn't he? Feeling like cowering prey, pursued by invisible hunters who could kill you from miles away, no matter where you hid.
Precisely. And then there was the mud at places like Passchendaele. It wasn't just mud. It became this killing entity in itself, often 10, maybe 20 feet deep in places. It swallowed men, mules, even vehicles whole. Official reports describe men sinking, comrades trying to pull them out with rifles hooked under their arms, and it making not the slightest impression. The man just stretches and sinks deeper.
God, there's that account of finding a trapped soldier 2 days later still sinking. Only his head was visible and he was raving mad. It led to that awful moral choice, didn't it? Soldiers begging their friends to shoot them rather than let them drown slowly in that mud soup.
Unfathomable choices. And on top of all that, the ultimate terror. Gas.
Yeah.
The accounts are chilling. Seeing that yellow or greenish clouds boiling toward you across no man's land. The immediate panic. Men ripping off uniforms, writhing on the ground, howling.
The description of the chirking.
Yeah.
Throttling themselves because they couldn't breathe. Realizing it was their own hands at their necks doing the throttling. Just horrific.
And the aftermath. Waking up in a yellow world. Uniforms stained yellow. Leaves on trees limp and dead. Everything soaked in this dreadful poison. Survivors often blinded or their lungs permanently destroyed, unable to walk upstairs for the rest of their lives.
It's crucial we understand this level of suffering because everyone on the Western Front faced it, but now we have to add the layer that was unique to the German soldier, the thing that made his experience fundamentally different and ultimately maybe decisive, the British blockade, the starvation.
Yes, that pivot is absolutely critical. All soldiers endured the mud, the rats, the shells, the gas, but the German soldier did it while starving. And while knowing his family back home was also starving. That's the key distinction. That's what ultimately broke the German will.
Germany went into the war assuming it would be quick, right? No real plan for a long haul. They relied on imports for, a third of their food, fertilizers, animal feed?
Pretty much. So when the British Navy imposed the blockade, it wasn't just about stopping weapons. It was a total economic siege. Churchill himself called it treating Germany like a beleaguered fortress, aiming to starve the entire population, civilians included, into submission. And it worked. Slowly, brutally.
Early on, they tried rationing, mixing potato into bread flour.
Right. But soon potatoes got scarce too, so they moved to corn, lentils. By late 1916, the situation was so desperate they were making K-Brot, war bread, using extenders like sawdust and straw. Literally sawdust.
You could see the physical effects on the population, couldn't you? That diary entry from Princess Blucher.
Yes, the English princess married into German nobility. She wrote about how the rounded contours of the German nation were gone. We are all gaunt and bony now. And constantly obsessed with the next meal. The whole population was physically wasting away.
And that led into the turnip winter of 1916-17. Potatoes basically disappeared. People lived on turnips and cabbage.
Yeah, imagine. Meat consumption dropped to something like 12% of pre-war levels.
And hunger just destroys the fabric of society, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Looting, theft, food riots, often led by desperate women, became common. It wasn't just the poor either. Middle-class housewives searching through garbage bins for scraps.
The sources describe old people, women, children wandering fields outside towns, looking for roots, bugs, anything edible, just mass scavenging for survival.
And the death toll from starvation and related diseases. It's estimated at around 800,000 German civilians. To give that scale, it's like 4 million Americans dying of hunger in the same period. Just catastrophic.
And the diseases that followed. Weakened immune systems meant TB rates, typhoid rates nearly doubled.
And the children. Always the children suffer most. Doctors reported half the kids in big cities were anemic. 40% had rickets from malnutrition. They saw children with hunger edema, these grotesquely swollen bodies but stick-thin limbs, a terrible paradox. The sources mention the old died quietly, but the children's cries cannot be stilled.
So picture this. You're a German soldier. You're enduring the hell of the trenches we just described. You believe you're fighting for the fatherland. Then you get leave. You go home.
And what do you find? Not patriotic unity. You find your wife skeletal, citing in food cues. Your children have those bloated, distended bellies of starvation and edema. Society's degrading. You then have to return to the front, carrying that image, that knowledge that your family is slowly starving to death because of the enemy blockade.
That double burden, the frontline horror and the home front starvation, that's the context for the desperation of 1918, isn't it? They didn't just want to win. They felt they had to win, or everything, their families, their nation, would just cease to exist, like that South African veterans' country.
Exactly. And that unique pressure cooker environment, it produced a certain kind of mentality in some soldiers. Men who didn't just endure the war, but almost embraced it, found their purpose in it.
The sources highlight two key examples, right? Ernst Jünger and Adolf Hitler. Jünger, the officer, explicitly called comfort a poison. He seemed to feel truly alive only in combat.
His writing is intense on this point. He talks about war, elevating the human spirit, feeling reverence for oneself in battle. What is more sacred than a fighting human being? For men like Jünger, war wasn't a job. It was the ultimate experience, the highest calling.
And then there's Hitler, a very different background, but a similar reaction to the war itself. In 1914, he's basically a nobody, right? A struggling artist in Munich, barely getting by.
Living hand to mouth, yeah. But when war breaks out, he describes being overcome with rapturous enthusiasm. Volunteers immediately, even though he'd been rejected as unfit before.
And his intro to combat was brutal. Bullet tears his sleeve on day one. Most of his initial group dead or wounded within weeks. Regiment takes 70% losses.
Yet he sticks it out and eventually becomes a dispatch runner for regimental HQ.
Which sounds safe, maybe, like a desk job. But the sources say it was incredibly dangerous.
Highly dangerous. These runners were vital when the phone lines were cut by shelling, which was constantly. They had to cross exposed ground, often alone during bombardments, carrying messages. They were, quote, invaluable and constantly at risk.
And Hitler, despite being described as socially awkward, didn't drink, smoke, preferred reading Schopenhauer to small talk, he gained a reputation for courage.
Yeah, reliable, brave, unusually eager to get up front, even volunteering for other runners' dangerous missions.
He won medals for bravery, too. The Iron Cross Second Class early on for pushing his commander out of the way of fire. And later the Iron Cross First Class, which was unusual for an enlisted man, wasn't it? Usually for officers.
It was, yeah. It suggests genuinely recognized bravery over a sustained period. Now, obviously, we have to be cautious with anything related to Hitler, especially accounts that might have been amplified later.
Absolutely. Critical context is essential. But even contemporaneous accounts seem to confirm his dedication. There's the story of his dog, Foxel, this little white terrier he trained. Apparently he used the dog's tricks to cheer up the troops and was genuinely devastated when the dog was lost later. Shows a different side.
Perhaps. But maybe more revealing psychologically is his own writing about overcoming fear. He tells that story about hearing a voice, an internal command telling him to move from a spot just moments before a shell landed there, killing everyone he'd been sitting with. And his conclusion wasn't just relief, it was that the war, despite its horror, had forged his will into the undisputed master over instinct. He saw that transformation as the point.
That kind of willpower, that fanatical dedication, was exactly what the German High Command was counting on for the 1918 offensive. Ludendorff knew the old tactics, just throwing waves of men at trenches, were suicide by this point. He needed something new.
Right. So he gathered his best minds, they analyzed past failures, and they came up with a whole new doctrine: the attack in position warfare. The core idea: ditch the battering ram approach. Instead of frontal assault, focus on pervasiveness. Penetrate, flow around obstacles, isolate strong points.
This is where the famous stormtroopers come in, right? And the new infantry tactics.
Exactly. They created small, flexible infantry groups built around a machine gun. And then the elite stormtroopers. These guys were highly trained, heavily armed, and crucially empowered to think for themselves.
How did their attacks actually work? What was different?
Two key things. First, the creeping barrage. Artillery lays down a moving wall of fire, timed precisely, advancing maybe 100 meters every few minutes. The stormtroopers followed this wall of explosions extremely closely, hugging the barrage. The idea is they arrive the instant the shelling lifts, before defenders can recover.
Okay, so they get in close and fast. What's the second part?
Decentralized command and bypassing resistance. If a stormtrooper unit hits a tough machine gun nest, they don't stop and fight it head-on. They skip it. Flow around and keep pushing deep into the enemy rear, cut communication lines, cause chaos. They leave the strong point for the follow-up, regular infantry waves to mop up. It's about infiltration, speed, and disruption, not just attrition.
Ernst Jünger was one of these stormtrooper commanders, wasn't he? He writes about the intense preparation for Operation Michael, the big spring offensive in March 1918.
Yes, he commanded an elite company. He talks about the intense training, the drills, and feeling this brazen spirit of the attack building among the men. This was it, the final push.
But even before the attack started, the war's shadow was there. Jünger's company got shelled while they were waiting to go.
Yeah. A single shell landed among them, killed or wounded half his men instantly. A devastating blow right before the main event. And Jünger describes his own moment of breaking. Running away in terror, hiding in a shell hole.
But then he pulls himself together, that internal voice.
Right, the voice of duty. Man, you're the company commander. He forces himself up, goes back to the carnage, apparently breaks down sobbing, but then immediately gets back to organizing the survivors. It's an incredible encapsulation of the pressure.
And then the offensive begins. 5:05 a.m., March 21st, 1918. The hurricane of mass artillery.
The descriptions are apocalyptic. The noise just builds and builds until it's not individual guns, just one continuous wall of smoke, flame, and poison gas. Pure industrial destruction unleashed.
The numbers are insane. Over 1 million shells fired in just 5 hours.
1,160,000 shells and mortar rounds. That's like 64 shells landing every single second for 5 straight hours. Unimaginable firepower. And as that barrage lifts and rolls forward, Jünger leads his men over the top. His account of the charge is raw. He admits being in a state of bloodthirstiness, anger, and alcohol, seething with this incomprehensible fury, this overwhelming desire to kill.
He runs ahead, pistol in one hand, his commander's riding stick in the other, and there's that strange moment of mercy, isn't there? The wounded enemy soldier holding up a family photo.
Yeah, he points his pistol, sees the photo, lowers it, spares the man. A flicker of humanity.
But just moments later, he's in brutal hand-to-hand combat, firing his pistol empty, grabbing a rifle from a stunned corporal, shooting down fleeing enemies, folding them up like a pocket knife, as he put it.
It's that duality again, isn't it? The sophisticated tactics, the desperate hunger, the advanced weaponry, and this primal close-quarters killing rage. That was the spearhead of the final German gamble.
And initially, Operation Michael seemed to work spectacularly well, didn't it? The Germans broke through, advanced further and faster than anyone had seen since 1914. They took something like 100 square miles, captured almost 40,000 Allied soldiers in the first couple of days. Ludendorff's new tactics were succeeding. The gamble looked like it might pay off.
It did, tactically at first. But the success itself contained the seeds of its failure. The German soldiers, already malnourished from years of the blockade, fighting intensely for days with little sleep, carrying all that heavy gear. They literally just ran out of gas. They outpaced their own supply lines, which were struggling anyway. The physical limits imposed by that long-term starvation simply couldn't be overcome by willpower or tactics alone.
And then came the psychological blow, when they overran the Allied positions, the supply depots.
Yes, this, according to the sources, was perhaps even more devastating than the physical exhaustion. Remember, the German government, the propaganda machine, had been telling everyone, soldiers and civilians, that the enemy was suffering too, that the blockade hurt everyone, that German resilience was superior.
But that's not what they found, was it?
Not at all. They found Allied storerooms overflowing, supplied beyond their wildest dreams.
Whole crates of eggs, wonderful thick jams, coffee, liqueur, high-quality chocolate, good boots, warm uniforms. Everything the German soldier hadn't seen in years, if ever.
Jünger himself wrote about the impact. It wasn't just envy. It was the sudden, crushing realization that the core idea driving them, that they were enduring unique hardship through superior will, was a lie. They had been fighting like hell, living like, as one source put it, Chinese coolies, only to find their enemies were comparatively living in luxury. It shattered morale.
And at the same time, they started seeing the sheer global reach of the forces against them, right? The Weltkrieg, the World War became real.
Exactly. They were capturing not just British and French troops, but Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Algerians, Senegalese, even Chinese Labor Corps members. It hammered home the reality. The whole world was lined up against them, their shrinking pool of underfed soldiers against seemingly limitless global manpower and resources.
That shock, combined with the exhaustion, it created fertile ground for defeatism to spread. And didn't the German authorities make a mistake earlier that year that made things worse?
They did. Back in January, as punishment, they'd sent a bunch of striking factory workers and anti-war socialists to the front lines. The idea was that the trenches would discipline them. Instead, these guys, already filled with what the officers called the red disease, started actively spreading dissent among the exhausted troops.
So instead of just pushing forward, soldiers started thinking more about survival.
Precisely. Insubordination grew. The new infiltration tactics, which relied on initiative, kind of backfired. Some units used their autonomy not to push deeper, but to retreat, loot those captured supplies, or just stop fighting altogether. The focus shifted from victory to self-preservation.
Hitler apparently got furious about this, didn't he? Calling the strikes back home chainery, basically treachery. He even physically attacked a new NCO who was bad-mouthing the war effort, alienated the new guys but solidified his bond with the veterans, shows that split in the army itself.
That internal division was becoming critical. Ludendorff had to call off Operation Michael by early April 1918. It had gained ground, yes, but at a horrific cost, especially among those elite stormtroopers. And the ground wasn't strategically decisive. He launched follow-up offensives, Georgets, Bellucci pushing towards Paris, even shelling the city with long-range guns.
But the momentum was gone. The German army was bleeding out, running on fumes. And then the final nail in the coffin, the Americans arriving in force.
Yes, 250,000 fresh American troops landing every month by the summer. They were inexperienced, sure, green, but they were well-fed, physically imposing compared to the Germans who called them giants, and full of this naive enthusiasm. Critically, they fought well in early engagements like Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood. That didn't just add manpower, it massively boosted Allied morale and correspondingly crushed German hopes. The tide had irrevocably turned.
And as if all that wasn't enough, nature delivered another blow. The Spanish flu pandemic.
Right. And it hit the German army incredibly hard. Why? Because their immune systems were already wrecked by years of malnutrition due to the blockade. They were far more susceptible than the better-fed Allied troops.
So entire divisions were basically incapacitated.
Yeah, army commanders started reporting back to HQ that their divisions were so weakened by flu and exhaustion, they literally could not resist an Allied attack, let alone mount one of their own. The war was being lost to starvation, logistics, global manpower, and now disease.
Jünger fighting through those final weeks, getting wounded again and again 7 times in total, officially. He captured that feeling, didn't he?
He wrote about the fatal sense of hopelessness that finally descended. The realization, no longer could we achieve victory. The game was up.
And the final collapse didn't even happen because the front lines broke, did it? It started back in Germany.
With the Navy, ironically. The German admirals, facing defeat, decided they wanted one last blaze of glory, a suicidal final battle against the British fleet rather than the humiliation of surrender.
But the sailors weren't having it.
Not a chance. In Kiel, in late October 1918, the sailors, many influenced by the revolutionary ideas spreading from Russia and within Germany, just refused the order. They mutinied. And the officers made the fatal mistake of arresting the ringleaders, which just ignited the whole thing. That naval mutiny sparked the German Revolution of 1918.
And it spread rapidly. Protests, uprisings.
Like wildfire across Germany. And crucially, many soldiers and officers, even those who weren't revolutionaries, were just done. Done fighting to save an empire that had let their families starve while they bled in the trenches. They weren't willing to fire on fellow Germans to prop up the old regime.
So November 9th, 1918, the Kaiser is told it's over, he's abdicated, he flees to Holland the next day. The German Empire effectively ceases to exist. Even while its armies were still technically holding lines, often deep in France and Belgium.
An unbelievable situation. And the returning soldiers. The reception they got was just brutal. Instead of heroes' welcomes, they arrived at train stations to be cursed, spat on, sometimes beaten, their medals ripped off by revolutionary mobs. You can understand why they didn't feel defeated in battle. They felt utterly betrayed, stabbed in the back by the politicians and revolutionaries at home.
Hitler himself, recovering in a hospital, blinded by a gas attack. He heard the news of the armistice and the revolution, and apparently wept bitterly. His first tear since his mother died. He couldn't comprehend it except as a conspiracy, a betrayal from within.
And it's so important to remember the armistice on November 11th, 1918. It stopped the fighting on the Western Front. But the war wasn't truly over for many. Revolution and civil war were breaking out all across Central and Eastern Europe as the old empires collapsed.
Which leads to that really chilling final quote from the German soldier who joined one of the Freikorps, the right-wing militias fighting the communists.
Yeah. We were told the war was over. That made us laugh. We are the war.
Wow. The trauma, the violence, the political extremism forged in those trenches. It wasn't going away just because an armistice was signed. It was going to shape the next 20 years. So let's try and pull this all together. This deep dive into Germany's final gamble. What's the core takeaway? We've seen the German soldier endure this almost unimaginable hell. The trenches, the filth, the rats, the gas, combined with the unique burden of starvation for them and their families.
And despite their army's tactical brilliance, maybe even superiority at times, the empire was ultimately brought down, not just by enemy armies, but fundamentally by logistics, that relentless British blockade and the psychological collapse that followed from the starvation it caused. The 1918 offensive, Operation Michael, it was tactically innovative, maybe even genius in conception. But like we said, even the strongest will, the best tactics, they hit a wall against basic math, physics, the limits of starving human bodies, especially when the resources of the entire rest of the world are stacking up against you.
It's a stark lesson in the limits of endurance, isn't it? And a grim foreshadowing of what industrialized total war really meant. But it brings us back to that psychological point we started with. How do people cope with that level of suffering when it ultimately leads to defeat?
And the sources really point towards the stab-in-the-back myth. The idea that the army wasn't beaten, but betrayed by civilians, politicians, Jews, socialists back home, becoming a necessary psychological defense. Think about it. You've endured 4 years of the trenches, you've seen unspeakable things, you've starved, your family is starved, you've given literally everything, and you still lose.
So what's easier to believe? That all that sacrifice, all that suffering was ultimately for nothing, that it was futile, or that you were winning, that your sacrifice mattered, but it was ruined by traitors, by an internal conspiracy.
Exactly, which reality is less painful to live with. And history suggests that the second belief, stab-in-the-back myth, however false, was the one that allowed many of those soldiers to process the trauma, to maintain some sense of meaning, and tragically, allowed them to keep fighting, channeling that bitterness into the political violence that led directly towards the next World War.
A truly sobering thought to end on, something to definitely mull over. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.